She signed, finally. Daniel Whitmore laughed loud, sharp, ugly, and snatched the divorce papers off the table before the ink was dry. He had spent 12 years stealing everything from Emily Carter, her confidence, her company, her father's legacy. Now he was walking out of that courtroom, with all of it leaving her with nothing but a small settlement and a broken name. He never once looked back at her. If he had, he would have seen something that should have terrified him. Emily was not crying. She was watching him go with the calm, patient expression of a woman who already knew exactly how this ended. The morning Daniel Whitmore filed for divorce, he wore his best suit. Not because he was nervous, not because he felt the gravity of ending 12 years of marriage to a woman who had stood beside him through every chapter of his adult life. He wore his best suit because he wanted Emily to see him at his most powerful. He wanted the image of him confident, polished, untouchable, to be the last version of himself she carried with her when she walked out of his life forever. He had rehearsed how this day would go in his mind 100 times. Emily would cry. She would beg maybe, or at least hesitate. She would sign the papers eventually, because she always did what Daniel needed her to do, even when it cost her everything. And then he would walk out of that courthouse into the life he had been quietly building for the past 3 years, the life that had nothing to do with her. He had not told Emily that he had a new apartment already furnished. He had not told her that Victoria Hayes, his personal assistant, 31 years old, with a laugh that filled every room she entered, had already helped him choose the curtains. He had not told her about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, or the restructured trust agreements, or the very careful, very patient rearrangement of Carter Industries' financial architecture that had been happening right beneath Emily's nose for the better part of a decade. He had not told her any of it, because he did not need to. Emily Carter, in Daniel's estimation, was not the kind of woman who looked underneath things. She was the kind of woman who believed what she was told. And Daniel had spent 12 years telling her exactly what he needed her to believe. He told her she was too emotional to sit in board meetings. He told her the company's finances were complicated, that her father's old guard didn't respect her, that the industry had shifted in ways she didn't understand. He told her gently, sympathetically, with his hand on her shoulder and his eyes full of manufactured concern, that the kindest thing he could do for her was to handle everything himself. He told her she was better suited to the charitable work, the public-facing events, the warm human side of the Carter brand, while he managed the real machinery behind closed doors. He told her this so many times in so many variations that she stopped arguing somewhere around year 4 and started agreeing somewhere around year 7, and by year 12 she had almost completely forgotten that she had once walked into her father's company at 22 years old with a leather binder full of ideas and the absolute certainty that she was born to run it, almost. There was still something in Emily Carter that Daniel could not reach. Something quiet and stubborn and buried so deep beneath everything he had layered on top of it that he had mostly stopped noticing it was there. He had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a sound that has been in the background so long it becomes part of the silence. He would remember that mistake for the rest of his life. But this morning, standing in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie, he was not thinking about mistakes. He was thinking about freedom. He was thinking about Victoria and the trip to the Amalfi Coast they had planned for September. He was thinking about the restructured board vote scheduled for the following month, the one that would formally consolidate his authority over Carter Industries, now that the marriage and the complicated trust clauses that came with it would be legally dissolved. He was thinking about the clean, unobstructed future that began today, the moment Emily signed her name to the bottom of those papers and removed herself from his story permanently. He allowed himself one small smile in the mirror. Then he drove to the courthouse. Emily was already there when he arrived. She was sitting in the hallway outside the courtroom on a wooden bench, wearing a gray dress that was not quite formal and not quite casual, and she was looking at her hands. Not at her phone, not at the door, not at the people moving around her. Just at her hands, the way someone looks at something familiar that has recently become strange. Her attorney, a woman named Rosalind Park, sat beside her with a briefcase on her lap and the expression of someone who had been in rooms like this so many times that the gravity had worn smooth. She was saying something to Emily in a low voice, and Emily was nodding, and Daniel watched the two of them for a moment before Emily looked up. Their eyes met. Daniel expected something. He was not sure what sadness maybe, or the trembling around the mouth that he had learned to recognize over 12 years as the precursor to Emily losing her composure. He expected her to look the way she had looked when he had first told her he was filing, like something had been cut out of her. She did not look that way. She looked at him steadily, and she nodded once, and she looked back down at her hands. Something about that made Daniel's jaw tighten in a way he could not immediately account for. He dismissed it. He crossed the hallway, exchanged a few clipped words with his own attorney, Mitchell Crane, a sharp, well-compensated man from a firm that had been handling Daniel's private legal matters for 6 years, and then the bailiff called them in. The courtroom was small and overly lit and smelled faintly of industrial cleaning fluid. Judge Michael Reynolds was already seated, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with reading glasses perched at the end of his nose, and the particular stillness of someone who had been listening to other people's worst days for 30 years and had stopped being surprised by any of it. The proceedings began. Mitchell Crane presented the settlement terms with the smooth efficiency of a man who knew the terms were already agreed upon. Emily's attorney raised 2 procedural objections, both of which were noted and dismissed. The asset division was reviewed line by line, the house in Beacon Hill, going to Daniel the smaller property in Vermont, going to Emily, the investment accounts divided, according to the agreement Emily had signed 3 weeks earlier, after Mitchell Crane had assured her it was fair, and Rosalind Park had advised her quietly and carefully that fighting it would be expensive and prolonged and uncertain. Emily had agreed. She had sat across the table from Daniel in a conference room and looked at the numbers he and Mitchell had prepared, and she had said in a voice so calm it had almost unsettled him, "Fine, if that's what you want, Daniel, fine." He had expected more resistance. He had prepared for it. He had a second set of documents ready, a more adversarial approach, the kind that involved depositions and forensic accountants and things Daniel absolutely did not want anyone looking at too carefully. But Emily had not fought him. She had just agreed, and he had felt the specific, slightly hollow relief of a man who had braced for a blow that never came. Now in the courtroom, he watched her sitting at the table beside Rosalind Park, and he felt that same puzzling stillness coming off of her. She answered the judge's questions clearly and without hesitation. She did not cry. She did not look at him with the expression of a wounded woman, the expression he had been in some part of himself prepared to feel guilty about. She just sat there, composed, and waited for it to be over. Judge Reynolds walked through the final terms. He asked both parties if they understood and accepted the settlement. Both said yes. He reached for the document. He looked at Daniel. "Mr. Whitmore, if you're ready." Daniel picked up the pen, and he smiled. He could not help it. The smile came from somewhere below thought, from the place where the relief and the victory and the clean beginning all lived together, and he knew he should not be smiling in a courtroom while dissolving his marriage, but he also did not particularly care. He clicked the pen once, a small, sharp sound in the quiet room, and he signed his name with a flourish that was entirely unnecessary, the signature of a man who believed he was signing the first page of the rest of his life. He set the pen down. He leaned back slightly in his chair, and he glanced at Emily just once, just for a moment, with the expression that said without a single word that this was the most complete version of winning he had ever felt. Emily looked at him. Her face was still. Her hands were still in her lap, and then she looked away from him back to the judge, and she said nothing at all. Judge Reynolds looked down at the document. He initialed the bottom of each page with the methodical certainty of a man who had signed hundreds of these. He reached the final page. He was about to speak, to say the words that would dissolve the marriage of Daniel and Emily Whitmore and release Daniel into the gleaming future he had engineered, when the door at the back of the courtroom opened. A court clerk walked in. She was young, maybe mid-20s, carrying a large manila envelope sealed with red wax and stamped with a notation Daniel could not read from his position at the table. She walked to the clerk of court, who accepted it, examined it briefly, and then stood and carried it to Judge Reynolds. Judge Reynolds looked at the envelope. He looked at it for longer than Daniel would have liked. Then he removed his reading glasses and exchanged them for a different pair from his breast pocket, the kind people wore when they needed to read very small print, very carefully, and he said, "Counsel, I need a moment." Mitchell Crane straightened in his seat. "Your Honor, the settlement terms have been fully agreed upon by both parties. I'm not sure what—" "I said I need a moment, Mr. Crane." Mitchell Crane stopped talking. The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Reynolds examined the envelope from several angles, read the notation on the outside, and then looked up at both tables with the expression of a man who had just encountered something he did not expect, but was fully prepared to deal with. "This," he said, holding the envelope slightly aloft, "has been filed with this court under the authority of the Carter Family Trust, executed originally under the name of Thomas Allen Carter, and marked for presentation upon the legal dissolution of the marriage between Daniel Whitmore and Emily Carter Whitmore." He paused. It appears that the estate of Thomas Carter anticipated this proceeding. The silence that followed was so complete that Daniel could hear the hum of the lights overhead. "What is that?" Daniel said. His voice was steady. His voice was always steady. "Mitchell, I don't know," Mitchell said quietly. He said it in the voice of a man who had just discovered a step was missing from a staircase he had been confidently descending. "Your Honor, I would like to understand the nature of—" "You'll understand it when I read it," Judge Reynolds said. He opened the envelope. Daniel turned to look at Emily. She was not looking at the judge. She was not looking at the envelope. She was looking at Daniel, calm, steady, and there was something in her eyes that he had not seen in so long he almost could not name it. It was certainty. Not the brittle, performed certainty of someone trying to appear unafraid, the real kind, the kind that came from knowing something the other person did not know yet. Daniel's chest contracted. "This document," Judge Reynolds said, unfolding several pages from the envelope, "is an amendment to the last will and testament of Thomas Allen Carter, recorded with Carter and Associates Legal Group 11 years ago, and placed in escrow with instructions that it be delivered to any court presiding over divorce proceedings involving Daniel Whitmore and Emily Carter." He looked up over his glasses. Thomas Carter filed this amendment 4 months before his death. The blood drained from Daniel's face. He thought of Thomas Carter. He thought of the man's steady eyes, the way he had looked at Daniel across a dinner table 9 years ago, without hostility, without accusation, with just that particular quiet that Daniel had always interpreted as acceptance, and now understood with the cold clarity of a man watching a door swing open on a room he had assumed was empty, was something else entirely. It was patience. Thomas Carter had been patient. "The amendment reads as follows," Judge Reynolds said. He settled his glasses more firmly on his nose and began. The room listened. Daniel sat very still. The document was not long. Thomas Carter had been a man who believed in plain language, and his attorney had apparently shared that belief because what Judge Reynolds read was direct and unambiguous and landed in the courtroom with the quiet force of something that had been built to last. The amendment stated that Daniel Whitmore had been permitted during his marriage to Emily to exercise operational authority over Carter Industries under the terms of the family trust. That permission, the document stated, was conditional. It was conditional upon his fidelity to Emily Carter as her husband. It was conditional upon his honest stewardship of Carter Industries' assets. And it was conditional upon his acting at all times in the interests of the Carter family legacy rather than his own. If any of those conditions were violated by documented evidence of infidelity, by financial misconduct, or by actions taken against Emily's interests during the marriage, then every voting share, every operational authority, every benefit extended to Daniel Whitmore through the Carter Family Trust would immediately revert to Emily Carter. Immediately. Not upon legal determination, not upon a court order. Immediately by the terms of the trust itself, activated by the filing of divorce proceedings under conditions of misconduct. The trust executor, Judge Reynolds continued, submitted this document accompanied by a preliminary report from a financial forensics firm retained by the Carter estate 18 months ago. He looked up again, this time directly at Daniel. That report identifies irregularities in Carter Industries' financial records beginning approximately 7 years ago. Mitchell Crane's hand found Daniel's arm under the table. His grip was firm. It was the grip of a man communicating without words that Daniel should not speak. Daniel could not have spoken if he tried. "Your Honor." Rosalind Park stood. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had been waiting a very long time for this particular moment. "The Carter estate has also asked me to inform the court that Emily Carter Whitmore has in her possession additional documentation relevant to the trust amendment." She reached into her briefcase, including a series of recorded conversations and financial records that corroborate the findings of the forensics report. Daniel's world tilted. Not metaphorically. The room actually seemed to shift slightly around him, the floor, undependable, the walls too close, the lights too bright. He gripped the edge of the table and tried to find something solid to think about. Victoria. He thought of Victoria. He thought of texting her, of calling her, of the conversation they had planned for tonight over dinner at the restaurant. They both loved the one where he was going to tell her that it was done, it was finally done, and their life could begin. He thought of the offshore accounts, the numbered ones, the ones that Mitchell had specifically told him were untraceable. He thought of Thomas Carter's quiet eyes watching him across a dinner table 9 years ago, patient as stone. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Reynolds said. Daniel looked up. The judge was looking at him with the expression of a man who had reached the end of his patience with theater and wished to get to business. "I'm going to need you and your counsel to remain in this courtroom." He set the document down on his desk with a deliberateness that carried its own kind of finality. "There are a number of matters we need to address." Mitchell Crane was already leaning toward Daniel, already speaking in a rapid, controlled whisper, already pivoting to the next move with the instincts of a man who had built a career on finding exits. But Daniel was not listening to Mitchell. He was looking at Emily. She had turned in her chair slightly, and she was watching him, and her face was not triumphant. She did not look like a woman who had won. She looked like a woman who had finally been allowed to put down something very heavy that she had been carrying for a very long time. She looked, in fact, like the woman he had first met at a Carter Industries board reception 14 years ago, before he had gone to work on her, before he had spent a decade rearranging her understanding of herself into something smaller and more manageable. She looked like herself. And Daniel understood in the specific and terrible way that people understand things when it is already too late to do anything, with the understanding that he had made the most catastrophic error of his life. Not the offshore accounts, not the falsified reports, not Victoria Hayes or the Amalfi Coast reservations or the restructured board vote. The catastrophic error was simpler than all of that. He had believed that Emily Carter was who he had made her into. He had looked at the woman he had spent 12 years diminishing, and he had seen the diminishment and mistaken it for the woman. He had not seen the thing underneath. He had not seen Thomas Carter's daughter. And Thomas Carter, patient and quiet and absolutely certain in the way of a man who had built something real and intended for it to outlast him, had seen everything. Judge Reynolds picked up his gavel, not to use it, just to hold it the way judges sometimes held things when they wanted the room to understand that the next phase of proceedings was about to begin, and it would look very different from the one that had just ended. "We'll take a 30-minute recess," he said, "and then we will be discussing the matter of Carter Industries in considerable detail." Mitchell Crane stood. His face was professionally neutral, the practiced blankness of an expensive attorney managing a situation in real time. "Your Honor, my client will of course cooperate fully with—" "Your client," Judge Reynolds said without looking up from his desk, "should probably let you do most of the talking from here on." The gavel came down once clean and final. The bailiff called the recess. Daniel sat in his chair and did not move. Around him the room filled with the quiet, controlled motion of people who had things to do. Clerks gathering papers, attorneys conferring Rosalind Park, leaning close to Emily and saying something that made Emily nod once decisively, with the nod of someone who has just been confirmed in a decision they made a long time ago. Daniel looked at his hands, the hands that had signed the papers 20 minutes ago, with a flourish, the signature that was supposed to be the beginning of his freedom. He understood now what it actually was. It was the beginning of the unraveling. And Thomas Carter, 11 years dead, had written the first line of it in plain language, sealed it in red wax, and waited for the precise moment when Daniel Whitmore, overconfident and careless, and finally certain that he had won, would walk directly into it. The pen was still on the table in front of him. Daniel stared at it. Outside the tall, narrow windows of the courtroom, it was a clear and ordinary morning. Somewhere across the city, Victoria Hayes was probably still in the apartment, probably drinking the coffee he had bought her before he left, probably looking at her phone and waiting for the message that would tell her it was done. She was going to be waiting a long time. Mitchell Crane touched his arm. "Daniel, we need to talk, right now." Daniel looked up at his attorney. Mitchell's face beneath the professional composure was the face of a man who had just realized that the case he believed he had won was in fact a very different case entirely. One with dimensions he had not accounted for, prepared by people who had been preparing for years. "How much," Daniel said quietly, "do they have?" Mitchell Crane was a man who did not flinch at hard questions. He had been asked hard questions in bad rooms for 30 years, but he flinched at that one, and in the flinch, Daniel had his answer. They had enough. They had more than enough. They had the kind of enough that Thomas Carter, methodical and far-sighted and absolutely unwilling to leave his daughter unprotected, had spent the last months of his life assembling with care. Daniel sat with that. The courtroom doors were closed. The bailiff stood by the far wall. Emily and Rosalind Park had stepped out into the hallway, and through the heavy wooden door, Daniel could hear nothing of their conversation, only the faint sound of voices that had the quality of people who were not panicking. Daniel thought about the smirk, the one he had worn when he signed the papers. I thought about how Emily had watched him wear it, and how she had looked back at the judge without expression, and how he had interpreted her composure as submission, when it was in fact something so different that the two things shared almost nothing except their silence. "Mitchell," he said. "Yes." When Thomas Carter filed that amendment, he stopped, started again. "Did anyone, was there any indication that he—" "No," Mitchell said. Flat, definitive, the voice of a man closing a door he wished had never been opened. "There was no indication. He never said anything to me. He was—" Daniel stopped again. "Quiet," Mitchell said. "Yes, I know. Quiet." The words settled over Daniel like something cold. Thomas Carter had been quiet. For 9 years, from the first dinner where he had met Daniel Whitmore, through the wedding, through the first board meetings, through the years of subtle erosion. Thomas Carter had been quiet, and Daniel had been so certain that the quiet was deference. He had been so certain. That certainty, that gorgeous, expensive, catastrophic certainty, sat in Daniel Whitmore's chest like a stone as the clock on the courtroom wall moved through the 30-minute recess each minute, carrying him further from the life he had planned and closer to the accounting he had not. And across the hall, in a small waiting area, with uncomfortable chairs and a window that looked out over a parking lot, Emily Carter sat with her attorney and said very little. She looked at her hands again, those still steady hands, and she thought about her father. She thought about the last conversation they had ever had 3 weeks before he died, when he had held her hand and said in that quiet, direct way of his that always made her feel like the most important person in any room. "Emmy, I have taken care of something for you. You won't know you need it until you need it. But when you need it, it will be there." She had not known what he meant. She had thought at the time that he might be talking about money, or the house, or the company shares. She had not understood until Rosalind Park had contacted her 14 months ago with a name, a forensic financial firm retained by the Carter estate executor, and a question. "Emily, how much do you actually know about what has been happening inside Carter Industries for the past 7 years?" The answer, it turned out, was very little. But the estate knew considerably more. And what the estate knew was documented, verified, time-stamped, and sealed in red wax inside a manila envelope that had been waiting in an escrow account for exactly the moment that Daniel Whitmore, certain of his victory, walked into a courtroom to collect it. Emily had spent 14 months working with Rosalind and the forensics team and the estate executor, quietly and carefully building the full picture of what Daniel had done. She had read the reports at night alone in the Vermont house she now lived in. She had read them with the steady deliberateness of a woman who was not in shock because she had, at some point in the middle of year 9 or 10 of her marriage, begun to understand that something was very wrong, even if she did not yet know exactly what. She had been told she was too emotional. She had been told she was too inexperienced. She had been told in countless small and patient ways that her instincts were not to be trusted. But instincts, it turned out, were difficult to kill entirely. And Thomas Carter's instincts, the instincts of a man who had built an empire on his ability to read people, had been considerably harder to kill than that. His instincts, in fact, were still very much alive. They were sitting in a manila envelope in the hands of Judge Michael Reynolds, who was in his chambers drinking coffee and reviewing the forensic report with the focused attention of a man who understood that the next phase of this proceeding was going to be considerably more complicated than the one he had prepared for this morning. When the bailiff knocked on the door of the waiting area and said it was time to go back in, Emily Carter stood. She straightened her gray dress. She thought of her father. She thought of the way he used to say when she was small, and something had frightened her. "Stand up straight, Emmy. The thing you're afraid of is always smaller than it looks." She walked back into the courtroom, and the second chapter of what Daniel Whitmore had set in motion began. The 30-minute recess felt like 30 years. Daniel sat at the defendant's table with Mitchell Crane speaking directly into his ear, low and rapid, and controlled the voice of a man running through options, the way a pilot runs through emergency procedures methodically without panic, because panic was a luxury neither of them could afford right now. But Daniel was not really listening. He was watching the door at the back of the courtroom, the one Emily had walked through with Rosalind Park, and he was thinking about Thomas Carter. I was thinking about the last time he had seen the man alive. It had been at a hospital. Thomas was already failing by then, the cancer having moved through him with the efficient indifference of something that did not negotiate. Daniel had sat beside the bed and held the old man's hand and said all the right things, the things a devoted son-in-law says to a dying father-in-law, the things that sound like love and are actually performance. He had said he would take care of Emily. He had said the company was in good hands. He had said Thomas could rest easy. Thomas had looked at him. Just looked at him, for a long moment that Daniel had interpreted at the time as the grateful exhaustion of a dying man who was relieved to be leaving his legacy in capable hands. He understood now what that look actually was. It was the look of a man who knew, who had always known, and who had already done something about it. Daniel, Mitchell's hand was on his forearm. I need you to focus, right now. Are you listening to me? I'm listening. Good. Because what I am about to tell you is important, and I need you to hear every word. Mitchell straightened slightly, adjusted his jacket, and dropped his voice another register. The forensic report they submitted is preliminary. Preliminary means it is not complete. It means there are findings that have not yet been fully verified. That is our first line. What's our second line? Mitchell paused, just briefly, just long enough for Daniel to feel the ground shift another half-inch beneath him. We're working on the second line, Mitchell said. Daniel looked at him steadily. Mitchell, how long have you known about this amendment? I did not know about it. How is that possible? You reviewed the Carter Trust documents when we restructured The amendment was not in the documents I reviewed, Mitchell said. His voice was precise and careful, the voice of a man choosing every word with full awareness that it might one day be repeated in a room he did not control. It was filed separately, held in escrow. It was specifically structured to be invisible to anyone conducting standard due diligence on the trust. Thomas Carter structured it that way. Thomas Carter's attorneys structured it that way. Yes, Daniel sat with that for a moment. Thomas Carter, in the last months of his life, had retained attorneys specifically to structure a legal document so that Daniel's own legal team would not find it. He had thought of everything. He had anticipated the due diligence. He had anticipated the restructuring. He had anticipated apparently the entire architecture of what Daniel was planning, and he had built around it the way a master carpenter builds around a flaw in the wood, not by confronting it directly, but by understanding its nature so thoroughly that you could design something that made the flaw irrelevant. He knew, Daniel said, not a question. It appears so. For how long? Mitchell considered this. Based on when the amendment was filed 11 years ago, I would say he knew from very early on. 11 years. Thomas Carter had sat across from Daniel at family dinners and board meetings and hospital bedside visits for 11 years, knowing what Daniel was knowing what Daniel intended and saying nothing, doing nothing visible, just watching, just waiting, just quietly, methodically constructing the trap that Daniel had walked into this morning, wearing his best suit and his most triumphant smile. The courtroom door opened. Emily and Rosalind Park walked back in. Daniel watched Emily cross the room to her table. She did not look at him. She set her bag down, said something quietly to Rosalind, and sat. Her posture was straight. Her hands, when she folded them on the table in front of her, were completely still. Daniel had spent 12 years telling Emily Carter that she was not strong enough for the arena. He had said it kindly. He had said it with concern in his voice and his hand on her shoulder. But he had said it consistently, and he had said it until she stopped pushing back. Looking at her now, he understood that he had been wrong about what he was doing. He had not been telling her she was weak. He had been warning himself, because some part of him, buried underneath the confidence and the calculation and the very expensive suits, had known from the beginning that Emily Carter was dangerous to him, not in the sharp, aggressive way of an opponent who comes at you directly, in the deep structural way of someone whose integrity was a form of power that his particular set of tools had no answer for. He had spent 12 years trying to bury that knowledge. It was sitting across the courtroom from him right now, composed and still waiting for Judge Reynolds to return. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Reynolds entered, settled himself, and looked at both tables with the expression of a man who had read the forensic report during the recess and found it significantly more detailed than he had anticipated. "Before we proceed," he said, "I want to establish the scope of what this court is now looking at. The amendment to the Carter Trust, as filed, activates upon verified evidence of financial misconduct during the marriage. The forensic report submitted by the Carter estate identifies 4 categories of concern." He looked down at the document. Unauthorized transfers of Carter Industries operating funds to entities not affiliated with the company. Systematic underreporting of company revenue in documents presented to the board and to Mrs. Whitmore during the marriage. The establishment of offshore accounts bearing the signatures of Mr. Whitmore and at least one other party. He paused. And evidence of deliberate misrepresentation to Mrs. Whitmore regarding the financial health of Carter Industries for the purpose of obtaining her agreement to the settlement terms presented in this proceeding. The room was very quiet. Daniel heard Mitchell inhale beside him. "Your Honor," Mitchell said, rising. "My client categorically, Mr. Crane." The judge's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "I am not asking for a response at this time. I am establishing scope. You will have an opportunity to respond. Please sit down." Mitchell sat down. Judge Reynolds looked at Rosalind Park. "Counselor, the estate executor, is he present?" "Hi, is Your Honor." Rosalind gestured to the gallery where a man in his late 60s, silver-haired and grave-faced, rose briefly and nodded. Daniel recognized him. Gerald Marsh, Thomas Carter's longtime attorney and the executor of his estate. Daniel had always found Marsh difficult, too quiet, too watchful, too much like Thomas Carter himself in the particular quality of his attention. He understood now why Thomas had chosen him. "Mr. Marsh will be available to testify regarding the chain of custody of the trust amendment and the commissioning of the forensic review," Rosalind continued. "We also have 3 witnesses prepared to speak to the financial transactions identified in the report." 3 witnesses, Daniel said under his breath. "Be quiet," Mitchell said. "Who are they?" "Daniel, be quiet." But Daniel already knew, with the sick certainty of a man watching a structure he built reveal all of its hidden stress points at once, that the witnesses were people he had trusted, people he had paid, people he had believed were as invested in the arrangement as he was, which meant they would never speak, which meant he was safe. He had believed that. He had believed a great many things this morning that were no longer true. "We'll hear from the estate representative first," Judge Reynolds said. "Mr. Marsh, please approach." Gerald Marsh walked to the stand with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had been preparing for this day for 11 years and had absolutely no intention of rushing it now that it had arrived. He was sworn in. Rosalind stood. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "can you describe the circumstances under which Thomas Carter came to create the trust amendment that has been presented to this court today?" Marsh settled his hands in his lap. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of a man who had been a careful steward of important things for a very long time and took that stewardship seriously. "Thomas came to me approximately 11.5 years ago," he said. "He had concerns about Daniel Whitmore that he had been developing for some time. He did not come to me with accusations. He came to me with a specific request." He paused. "He asked me to help him construct a legal protection for Emily that would be invisible to anyone conducting standard legal review of the trust documents, including anyone retained by Daniel, but that would be fully enforceable by any court with jurisdiction over the Carter estate." "And did he tell you why he believed this protection was necessary?" "He did." Marsh looked directly ahead, not at Daniel, not at Emily, at some point in the middle distance that seemed to be the place where the truth lived. "He told me he had seen Daniel begin to isolate Emily from the company's operations approximately 2 years into the marriage. He told me he had reviewed certain financial decisions Daniel had made with Carter Industries accounts that troubled him significantly, and he told me—" He stopped briefly, continued. "He told me that Daniel had made a comment at a family dinner that Thomas had never forgotten." "What was that comment?" "Thomas said that Daniel had looked at Emily across the dinner table and said with what Thomas described as a particular kind of smile that Emily was lucky to have someone who understood business handling things for her because she was built for better things than balance sheets." Marsh paused. "Thomas told me that was the moment he knew." Rosalind nodded. "Knew what specifically?" "That Daniel did not see Emily as a partner," Marsh said. "He saw her as an obstacle he had married in order to remove." The word landed in the courtroom the way certain words did not loudly, but with a weight that continued to press after the sound had faded. Daniel's jaw was tight. He was looking at the table in front of him with the focused attention of a man trying to control something that wanted very badly to be uncontrolled. "Mr. Marsh," Rosalind continued, "can you describe the scope of the forensic review commissioned by the estate? The review was commissioned 14 months ago when it became apparent that divorce proceedings were likely. We retained Hartwell and Associates, a financial forensics firm with specific experience in corporate asset cases. Their preliminary findings, which have been submitted to this court, identify approximately $37 million in funds transferred out of Carter Industries' operating accounts over a period of 7 years. 37 million. The number moved through the courtroom like a physical thing. Daniel heard someone in the gallery draw a sharp breath. He did not look up. "The transfers," Marsh continued, "were structured to appear as vendor payments, consulting fees, and operational expenses. In each case, the receiving entity was either a shell company registered in a jurisdiction with limited disclosure requirements or an account with direct ties to Mr. Whitmore. And the offshore accounts identified in the report. 3 accounts, 2 in the Cayman Islands, 1 in the Isle of Man. All 3 opened during the marriage. All 3 bearing Mr. Whitmore's signature on the account documentation." Mitchell was on his feet. "Your Honor, the defense reserves the right to examine the provenance of this documentation, including the methods by which the forensic team obtained," "Noted, Mr. Crane," the judge said. "You'll have that opportunity. Please continue, Mr. Marsh." Mitchell sat. Marsh looked at his hands briefly, then back up. "There is one additional element of the report I want to draw the court's attention to, because I believe it is relevant to the settlement terms that were under consideration when this proceeding began this morning." Judge Reynolds nodded. "The settlement presented to Emily Whitmore," Marsh said, "valued Carter Industries at approximately $42 million and proposed a 5% ownership stake for her upon dissolution of the marriage. Our forensic review, based on the actual financial performance of the company, the performance that was not reflected in the documents Daniel presented to Emily and her counsel, places the current value of Carter Industries at approximately $280 million. The gallery erupted. Not loudly, this was a courtroom, and there were bailiffs, but the sound of 20 people inhaling simultaneously was its own kind of eruption, a collective recognition of the specific obscenity of the number, the distance between 42 million and 280 million, the chasm of it, the years of deliberate misdirection required to maintain that gap. Emily did not react visibly. She sat with her hands folded and her eyes on Gerald Marsh, and her face the face of a woman who already knew this number because she had spent 14 months sitting with it, turning it over, understanding it in all its dimensions. Daniel reacted. He could not stop himself. His head came up sharply, and for one moment, just one, the professional composure cracked, and what was underneath it was visible, raw and unguarded, and very afraid. Then it was gone. He reassembled his expression into something neutral, but Rosalind Park had seen it, the judge had seen it, and Emily, who had spent 12 years learning to read the difference between Daniel's real face and his performed one, had seen it too. She looked at him steadily for 3 seconds, then she looked away. "Mr. Marsh," Judge Reynolds said once the room had settled, "one more question. The trust amendment, in your assessment as executor, does the evidence presented today meet the threshold required to activate its terms?" Marsh did not hesitate. "In my assessment, yes, unambiguously." "Thank you." Reynolds made a notation on the page in front of him. "Mr. Crane, you may cross-examine." Mitchell rose. He was composed. He was always composed. That was what Daniel paid him for, that composure, that ability to walk into the worst possible version of a situation and find the thread that unraveled it. He had done it before. He was very good at it. He spent 20 minutes with Gerald Marsh probing the forensic methodology, questioning the chain of custody of the trust amendment, pointing out that a preliminary report was not a final determination and that the defense would be retaining its own experts. Marsh answered every question with the measured patience of a man who had anticipated each one and had an answer prepared. Mitchell landed a few points. He was too skilled not to. He established that the forensic report had not yet been peer-reviewed. He established that the offshore accounts, while bearing Daniel's signature, had not been definitively proven to contain Carter Industries funds, specifically as opposed to Daniel's personal funds. He established that the trust amendment, while legally filed, had not yet been subject to challenge. They were real points. They were also, Daniel understood with growing clarity, the kind of points that won battles and lost wars. They were procedural handholds in a building that was coming down. When Mitchell returned to his seat, he leaned toward Daniel and said quietly, "We have room to work with. This is not over." Daniel looked at him. "Who are the three witnesses?" he asked. Mitchell's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but Daniel caught it. "Mitchell, who are they?" A pause. "Paul Reeves is one of them." Daniel felt the floor drop out from under him. Paul Reeves had been Daniel's chief financial officer at Carter Industries for 6 years. He had been the man who processed the transfers. He had been the man who maintained the dual set of financial records, the ones that showed the board and the one that showed the truth. He had been compensated extremely well for this service, and Daniel had always understood that the compensation was also a form of insurance, because a man who is well paid for his silence has every reason to maintain it. What Daniel had not fully accounted for was that a man who is well paid for his silence also knows exactly how much he is worth as a witness. And 14 months ago, someone had apparently made Paul Reeves an offer that recalibrated that calculation entirely. He flipped, Daniel said. It was not a question. He entered into a cooperation agreement with the Carter estate 14 months ago. Yes. What did he give them? Mitchell looked at the table. Everything. The word sat between them like a stone. Everything. Paul Reeves, who knew where every transfer had gone, who had built the architecture of the deception alongside Daniel, who had access to documentation that Daniel had believed was destroyed, Paul Reeves had given them everything. 14 months ago. While Daniel was planning the divorce, while he was having dinners with Victoria and choosing apartment furniture and congratulating himself on the elegance of his exit strategy, Paul Reeves had been sitting in a room with Rosalind Park and Gerald Marsh and the forensic team and disassembling the machine piece by piece. "What about the other two witnesses?" Daniel asked. "Sandra Cho," Mitchell said, "and James Whitfield." Sandra Cho had been his executive assistant for 4 years. James Whitfield had been on the Carter Industries board, one of Daniel's own appointments, a man who had voted consistently with Daniel on every matter for 7 years. "James," Daniel said, "James Whitfield." "He came forward 6 months ago," Mitchell said. He was apparently uncomfortable with what he described as the direction the company had been taking. Uncomfortable. James Whitfield, who had sat in boardrooms and voted with Daniel on every restructuring and every financial reallocation and every motion that had moved money out of Carter Industries and into the accounts Marsh had just described to the court, James Whitfield had been uncomfortable. Daniel thought about the last board meeting. He thought about James across the table, reliable and unquestioning as always. He thought about the handshake afterward, James's palm dry and firm, his eyes direct, his voice saying the same things it always said. He had been preparing to testify for 6 months, and Daniel had not known. He had not known about Paul. He had not known about Sandra. He had not known about James. He had not known about the forensic review or the 14 months of preparation or the 3 witnesses who had been building the case from the inside while he finalized his exit plan. He had believed he was surrounded by loyalty because he was surrounded by people he had paid. He had not understood that payment was not the same as loyalty, and that when a better offer came, or in some cases when the weight of what they had participated in became heavier than the money made it worth, paid people were also capable of choosing differently. Thomas Carter had understood this. Thomas Carter, who had built his company on the principle that the people around you reflected the kind of leader you were, had understood from the beginning that Daniel's purchased loyalty was the most fragile possible foundation for the empire he was trying to build. And so he had waited. He had waited for the loyalty to crack. He had waited for someone inside the machine to get tired or scared, or simply to reach the point where what they knew felt too heavy to keep carrying. He had set up the conditions through Gerald Marsh, through the forensic firm, through the carefully worded trust amendment that made cooperation with the estate the only rational choice for anyone who wanted to avoid being on the wrong side of the legal reckoning for that cracking to happen. And it had. In the seat beside Daniel Whitmore, Mitchell Crane straightened his papers and prepared to do what he was paid to do. He would fight. He would find the procedural angles and the evidentiary challenges and the arguments that bought time. He was very good at his job. But Daniel looked across the courtroom at Emily Carter, sitting with her hands folded and her face composed, and her father's 11 years of patient, invisible, meticulous protection arrayed around her like something structural, like the bones of a building, and he understood something that Mitchell's skills could not change. He had walked into this courtroom this morning believing the story was already over. Emily's father had known better. The story, it turned out, had been Thomas Carter's to end, and it was ending now. Rosalind Park rose from her chair. She buttoned her jacket. She looked at the judge with the focused clarity of a woman who had been waiting 14 months for this exact moment and intended to use every second of it. "Your Honor," she said, "the Carter estate would like to call its first witness." And Paul Reeves, 6 years of silence finally behind him, walked through the courtroom door. Paul Reeves walked to the stand the way a man walks when he has made a decision that cannot be unmade and has spent enough time with it to stop being afraid of it. I was 53 years old with the careful posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms where posture mattered, and he sat in the witness chair and placed his hands flat on his thighs and looked at Rosalind Park with the expression of a man who was ready. Daniel watched him from across the courtroom and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt genuinely uncertain. Not the performed uncertainty he sometimes deployed in negotiations, the studied hesitation designed to make the other side feel they had the upper hand before he pulled the ground out from under them. Real uncertainty, the kind that lived in the chest and made breathing slightly more complicated than it should be. Paul Reeves had sat 3 feet away from Daniel in board meetings for 6 years. He had processed every transfer. He had maintained the secondary set of financial records, with the meticulous attention of a man who understood that the gap between the two versions of reality had to be perfect, had to be seamless, had to be the kind of clean that survived any standard audit. He had done all of this, and Daniel had paid him extremely well, and Paul had driven a very nice car and taken expensive vacations and said the right things at the right times, and Daniel had looked at all of that and called it loyalty. I understood now that what he had been looking at was leverage. Paul Reeves had known for 6 years exactly where everybody was buried, and when Gerald Marsh and Rosalind Park had come to him 14 months ago with the forensic report and a cooperation agreement and an immunity arrangement that protected him from the worst of the potential exposure, Paul had done the math. The math had not favored Daniel. "Mr. Reeves," Rosalind began, her voice carrying the measured precision of someone laying foundation stones, "can you describe your role at Carter Industries during the period from approximately 7 years ago to the present?" Paul straightened slightly. "I served as Chief Financial Officer. My responsibilities included overseeing all financial reporting, managing the company's accounts and banking relationships, and advising the board on financial matters." "And during that period, did you report directly to Daniel Whitmore?" "I did." "Can you describe the nature of that reporting relationship?" Paul's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Daniel held operational authority over the company through his position as CEO and through his role as Emily Whitmore's spouse under the terms of the Carter Family Trust. He directed all significant financial decisions. My role was to implement those decisions and to ensure the financial records reflected. He stopped, started again. To ensure the financial records were structured as Daniel required. Rosalind let that hang in the air for exactly the right amount of time. "When you say structured as Daniel required, can you be more specific?" "Daniel maintained 2 sets of financial records," Paul said. His voice did not waver. "One set was the official record presented to the board, to Emily, and to external auditors. That set reflected the financial picture Daniel wanted people to see: a company that was underperforming, carrying debt, struggling with market conditions. The second set was the actual record, the real numbers." The courtroom was absolutely still. "And what did the real numbers show?" Rosalind asked. "Carter Industries has been consistently profitable for the entirety of the period in question. Revenue growth averaged 11% annually. The company's asset base grew from approximately $140 million to what our internal projections showed as approximately $275 million at the time I left the company." $275 million. Yes. And Emily Whitmore was told the company was worth approximately $42 million. That is correct. Rosalind walked to her table, picked up a bound document, and carried it to the witness stand. "Mr. Reeves, I'm showing you what has been marked as Exhibit 14. Do you recognize this document?" Paul took it. He did not need to examine it carefully. He had prepared it. Yes, this is the secondary ledger, the real financial record for Carter Industries covering the 7-year period identified in the forensic report. And this document, where was it maintained? On a private server, encrypted, Daniel-controlled access. I maintained a copy as, he paused, as insurance. That word insurance moved through the room like a current. Mitchell was on his feet instantly. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is characterizing his own behavior in a self-serving manner that overruled, Judge Reynolds said. The witness may continue. Paul looked at Mitchell briefly. Then he looked back at Rosalind. I maintained a copy because I understood at some level that the arrangement I had entered into with Daniel was not sustainable, and I wanted protection. Protection from what? From being the one left holding the evidence when it finally came apart. A pause. It always comes apart. Across the courtroom. Daniel felt Mitchell's hand press firmly on his forearm. A warning. He had been leaning forward without realizing it, his body responding to the testimony with an instinctive forward pitch, the posture of a man about to argue about, to object about, to do something to stop the words coming out of Paul Reeves's mouth. He forced himself back in his chair. He made his face neutral. He was very good at making his face neutral. It was harder than it had ever been. Mr. Reeves, Rosalind continued, let's discuss specific transactions. The forensic report identifies a transfer of $4.2 million on March 14th, 7 years ago. Can you describe that transaction? That was the first major transfer, Paul said. He did not need to consult notes. These numbers had been living in his memory for 7 years, occupying the particular space that guilt occupies the space that never quite empties. The funds were transferred from Carter Industries' primary operating account to a vendor account under the name Meridian Consulting Group. And what was Meridian Consulting Group? A shell company, registered in Delaware. The sole beneficial owner was Daniel Whitmore. A sound from the gallery, not loud, but present. So Carter Industries paid $4.2 million to a company owned by Daniel Whitmore under the guise of consulting fees. Yes. Was any consulting performed? Paul looked directly ahead. No. Rosalind nodded. She moved to the next transaction, and the next. She walked Paul Reeves through 11 separate transfers over 7 years. Each one documented, each one explained each one, landing in the courtroom with the cumulative weight of a structure being built from evidence rather than accusation. 11 transfers, $37 million. 7 years of careful patient theft conducted in the space between the two sets of books, in the gap between what Emily was told and what was true. Daniel listened to each one. He sat very still, and he listened, and he thought about the morning he had signed those divorce papers with his flourish and his smirk, the signature of a man autographing his greatest achievement. And he thought about how Thomas Carter's attorney had been sitting in this courthouse at that very moment with a sealed envelope and 11 years of patience. And he thought about how completely and catastrophically he had miscalculated what kind of man he was dealing with. He had thought he was dealing with a dying father. He had been dealing with a chess player who had already seen the endgame. When Rosalind finished with Paul Reeves and Mitchell Rose for cross-examination, he did what he was paid to do. He attacked the cooperation agreement. He questioned Paul's credibility as a witness, given his own participation in the alleged misconduct. He probed the secondary ledger's chain of custody and the server access logs and the encryption protocols. Paul answered steadily without defensiveness, with the particular calm of a man who has already made peace with what he is doing and is no longer available to be destabilized by questions he anticipated. Mitchell landed 2 points. He established that Paul had received immunity in exchange for his testimony, which the jury of perception in the gallery could weigh however they chose. He established that the secondary ledger had been in Paul's sole custody for a period of 3 years before being turned over to the forensic team, which raised a theoretical question about its integrity. 2 points. Against $37 million distributed across 11 documented transactions with corresponding shell company registrations. When Mitchell sat back down, Daniel looked at him. How bad is it? Mitchell considered the question with the honesty of a man who understood that the moment for strategic optimism had passed. It's significant, but Paul Reeves is one witness. His credibility is compromised by the immunity arrangement. The secondary ledger's chain of custody is a genuine issue. We still have room to— Sandra Cho is next, Daniel said. A pause. Yes. And then James Whitfield. Yes. Daniel looked at the witness stand where Paul Reeves was stepping down with the careful gait of a man who had just delivered a very heavy thing and felt the difference in his body of not carrying it anymore. Mitchell, Daniel said quietly, is there a version of this where we make it to tomorrow in a position that still gives us something to work with? Mitchell Crane was silent for 4 seconds. In a man of his experience and precision, 4 seconds was a very long time. There might be, he said, but it depends on what Whitfield says. James Whitfield. Daniel thought about the board meeting 6 months ago. James across the table, his eyes direct, his handshake firm. 6 months of preparation behind that handshake. Call it, Daniel said. Whatever you need to do, call it. Mitchell nodded once and began writing on the yellow legal pad in front of him. Sandra Cho was called to the stand. She was 44, precise and composed with the focused attention of a woman who had organized the minutiae of a powerful man's professional life for 4 years and had therefore seen things that powerful men assume their assistants did not notice or did not understand. She had noticed. She had understood. And for 4 years she had said nothing, because the salary was exceptional, and because the alternative saying something to whom about what, with what proof had seemed more frightening than the silence. Rosalind Park was methodical and patient with Sandra, the way she had been with Paul building the picture transaction, by transaction, conversation by conversation. Sandra had been present for discussions between Daniel and Mitchell Crane about the offshore accounts. She had booked travel for Daniel and Victoria Hayes on at least 14 separate occasions while Daniel was still married. She had been directed by Daniel to intercept and redirect certain financial correspondence before it reached Emily's desk. That last one produced the sharpest reaction from the gallery. Correspondence. From Carter Industries board members. From the company's primary banking partner. From the estate executor's office. Letters and emails and documented inquiries addressed to Emily Carter Whitmore as a trust beneficiary, intercepted and redirected by a woman who had been directed to do so by her employer, and who had done it because he had told her it was a legal arrangement, and she had believed him, or had wanted to believe him, which in the end amounted to the same choice. "Did you ever read any of the correspondence you were directed to intercept?" Rosalind asked. Sandra's hands, folded in her lap, tightened slightly. "Some of it, yes." "And did any of that correspondence suggest to you that Emily Whitmore was not receiving accurate information about the financial state of Carter Industries?" "Yes," Sandra said. Her voice was steady. "There was a letter from the board's independent auditor from 5 years ago. It flagged several of the vendor payments as unusual and requested a meeting with Emily directly as a trust beneficiary." She stopped. "Daniel had me send back a response on Emily's letterhead, saying she was satisfied with the existing reporting structure and did not require a meeting." The room absorbed this. Emily at her table did not move. But something in her posture shifted, a very small thing, the kind of shift that happens when a person hears a specific piece of information that fills in a gap they did not know was there when an absence that has been present so long you stopped noticing it suddenly has a shape, a name, an explanation. A letter from an auditor 5 years ago, an auditor who had noticed, who had reached out to her directly, whose reach had been intercepted by a woman sitting in a witness stand reading the words Emily should have received, sending back a response in Emily's name. For 5 years, Emily had lived with the vague but persistent feeling that something was wrong, that the company she had grown up watching her father build was somehow not the thing Daniel described when he talked about it, that the numbers did not feel right, even when she could not have said exactly why. She had trusted that feeling enough to eventually go to Rosalind Park. She had not known until this moment that an auditor had shared that feeling 5 years earlier and had tried to reach her. She thought about those 5 years. She thought about the board meetings she had been gently encouraged not to attend, the financial summaries she had been handed pre-digested, simplified, stripped of the texture that would have told her what she was actually looking at, the decisions she had been guided away from questioning in the patient, solicitous voice of a man who had everything to gain from her confusion. 5 years. She did not cry. She sat with her hands folded and her face still, and she let the information settle into the place where it belonged. Mitchell cross-examined Sandra with the same methodical skill he had applied to Paul Reeves. He established that Sandra had acted under direction and had not independently sought to deceive Emily. He established that the letter she had described had been one document among thousands processed during her time at the company. He established that her cooperation agreement, like Paul's, created an incentive to characterize events in a way favorable to the Carter estate. Sandra answered his questions directly and without embellishment. She did not attempt to minimize her role. She did not attempt to inflate it. She was a witness giving testimony about what she had seen and done, and she gave it with the straightforward accuracy of a woman who had decided that the only thing left to do was tell the truth cleanly and let the room make of it what it would. When she stepped down, the courtroom had the quality of a room in which many things had been said and were now sitting in the air accumulating. Judge Reynolds looked at the clock. He looked at both tables. "We'll take a 15-minute recess before the final witness," he said. The gavel came down. Daniel did not move. Mitchell was immediately beside him, speaking in the controlled, rapid voice. "James Whitfield's testimony is going to be the most damaging," he said. "He was on the board. He voted on the resolutions. He has direct knowledge of the board's official position versus what the actual financials showed. I need you to prepare yourself for—" "I know what James knows," Daniel said. Mitchell stopped. "Then you know what he's going to say." "Yes." A pause. "Daniel, we need to discuss the possibility of not here." "Then where?" "Because if Whitfield's testimony tracks with what I think it's going to—" "I said not here, Mitchell." Daniel's voice was low and very controlled. "When this recess is over, we go back in, we listen to James, and then we figure out what we're doing next." Mitchell looked at him for a moment with the expression of an attorney who understood that his client had just passed a point of no return and was either not ready to admit it or not ready to deal with what admitting it meant. Then he nodded and went to make a phone call. Daniel sat alone at the defense table. I was aware, with a peripheral kind of awareness, that the gallery was occupied by people who were watching him with various degrees of fascination and pity and judgment. He was aware that the court clerks were moving around the room with the purposeful efficiency of people who had things to prepare. He was aware of Rosalind Park at the other table speaking quietly with Emily, the two of them close together, in the way of people who have been through something difficult together and have reached a kind of trust that is different from the trust of ordinary professional relationships. I did not look at Emily. He could feel her in the way you feel a presence that has been at the periphery of your life for so long it has become part of the architecture of how you move through a room. 12 years. He had spent 12 years making himself the center of gravity in Emily Carter's universe, systematically dismantling every other source of certainty she had, until he was the primary source of her understanding of herself and the world. It was a very effective strategy. It was the kind of strategy that worked perfectly right up until the moment it collapsed, at which point it collapsed completely, because the entire edifice was built on a single point of control. And the single point of control was currently sitting alone at a defense table in a courtroom, listening to the clock on the wall mark the minutes of the recess. He thought about Victoria. I thought about her very specifically in the way a man thinks about the thing he was reaching for when the ground gave way beneath him. He thought about the apartment and the September trip and the life that was supposed to begin today. He thought about her laugh, the one that filled rooms, and he thought about the last conversation they'd had this morning before he left, when she had kissed him on the cheek and said, "Go get it done. I'll be here when you get back." She would be. For a while. But Victoria Hayes, for all her warmth and her enthusiasm and the genuine pleasure she took in the life Daniel had been building with her, was not a woman who would stay in a burning building. She had told him this herself once early in their relationship, framed as something else but clear in its meaning. She had said, with her direct and unambiguous way of seeing things, "I love winning Daniel. I don't love losing. I'm not built for it." He had loved her for saying it. He did not love it now. The bailiff announced the resumption of proceedings. Daniel straightened in his chair. Mitchell returned and sat beside him, tucking his phone away with the expression of a man who had made a difficult call and received a difficult answer. "Well," Daniel said, "our forensic expert needs 72 hours minimum to review the secondary ledger," Mitchell said quietly. "I'm going to request a continuance after Whitfield. Will Reynolds grant it?" "Probably. It's a reasonable request given the volume of material." He paused. "But Daniel, I need you to understand a continuance buys us time. It does not change the evidence. James Whitfield was called to the stand. I was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who had sat on corporate boards for 30 years and understood the gravity of institutional decisions. He had been Thomas Carter's contemporary, not a close friend, but a professional acquaintance of long-standing someone Thomas had trusted enough to invite onto the Carter Industries board in the company's earlier years. Daniel had cultivated him carefully after Thomas's death, recognizing that Whitfield's presence on the board provided a legitimacy that Daniel's own appointments could not generate. He had given Whitfield expanded influence, a significant compensation package, and the feeling of being essential. He had not given him the real financial records, that it turned out had been the error. Because James Whitfield had eventually noticed the gap between what he was being shown and what his 30 years of corporate experience told him the numbers should look like. He had noticed the vendor payment patterns that did not match operational logic. He had noticed the revenue projections that seemed systematically low. He had noticed, and he had said nothing to Daniel because he understood by then the nature of what he was dealing with, but he had started keeping his own notes. "Mr. Whitfield," Rosalind began, "you have served on the Carter Industries board for approximately 9 years. Is that correct?" "It is." "And during that time you voted in favor of a series of financial resolutions presented by Daniel Whitmore as CEO. Is that also correct?" Whitfield's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, that is correct." "Why?" The question was simple and direct, and it landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped in still water. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man who did not know the answer, the silence of a man deciding how much of it to give. Because the resolutions were presented with financial documentation that appeared on its face to support them, and because the board culture that Daniel cultivated. He stopped. It was not a culture in which dissent was comfortable. "Can you describe what you mean by that?" "Daniel had a way of making disagreement feel like disloyalty," Whitfield said. "If you questioned a financial decision, you were questioning his leadership. If you pushed back on a number, you were suggesting he was incompetent. It was very subtle, very sophisticated. But over time, it had the effect of making the board effectively a rubber stamp for whatever he wanted to do." "And when did you begin to suspect that the financial picture being presented to the board was not accurate?" "About 3 years ago," Whitfield said. "There was a revenue report for the third quarter that didn't track with what I was observing in the company's operational performance. The manufacturing divisions were running at capacity. The order book was full. The workforce was stable. None of that was consistent with the revenue numbers Daniel was presenting." "What did you do with that concern?" "Nothing immediately," Whitfield said. And the honesty of that answer, its directness, its absence of self-justification, was its own kind of testimony. "I was uncomfortable. I was uncertain about what I was actually seeing, and I was—" He paused. "I was aware of what raising concerns about Daniel tended to produce, so I waited, I continued to observe, and I began keeping personal notes. And those notes, are they part of the documentation submitted to this court?" "They are." "And what ultimately caused you to come forward?" Whitfield looked at his hands briefly. Then he looked at Rosalind. Then, for the first time since he had taken the stand, he looked directly at Emily. His expression was the expression of a man carrying something he had been carrying too long. "Thomas Carter was not a friend of mine in the conventional sense," he said. "But he was someone I respected enormously. He built something real. He built it with integrity, and he ran it with integrity, and when he died, he trusted that it would continue to be run that way." He stopped. "What I observed over the past 3 years was not that, and I reached a point where continuing to say nothing felt like," he searched for the word, "like a betrayal of someone who deserved better." The courtroom was very quiet. Emily looked at James Whitfield for a long moment. She did not say anything. She did not need to. But the quality of her looking was different from the way she had looked at Paul Reeves, or at Sandra Cho, or at the judge, or at Daniel. It was the look of a woman who had just received an unexpected kindness in the middle of a very hard day, and who recognized it for what it was. Mitchell's cross-examination of James Whitfield was shorter than his examinations of the previous witnesses. There were fewer angles to attack. Whitfield had no cooperation agreement. He had no immunity arrangement. He had received no benefit from coming forward, except the particular intangible benefit of sleeping better, which was not the kind of thing that made a strong cross-examination target. Mitchell focused on the note-keeping, suggesting that Whitfield's private records were inherently selective, reflecting what he chose to notice rather than a comprehensive picture. He questioned whether Whitfield's interpretation of the financial discrepancies was within his expertise, or whether it was lay speculation dressed as informed observation. He was professional and precise, and he did everything the situation allowed. When he sat back down, Daniel looked at him. Mitchell said nothing. That was answer enough. Judge Reynolds reviewed his notes. He looked at both tables. Given the volume of material introduced today and the complexity of the financial matters at issue, I am going to schedule a continuation of these proceedings. Before we adjourn, however, I want to address one matter directly. He removed his reading glasses and looked at Daniel. Mr. Whitmore, the evidence introduced in this proceeding today raises concerns that extend beyond the civil settlement terms under review. The financial transactions described by the witnesses today, if substantiated, may constitute criminal misconduct. I am therefore notifying both parties that I will be referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for independent review. The words fell into the room like something irrevocable. Criminal referral. Mitchell's pen scratched a rapid notation on his legal pad. Daniel sat absolutely still. Additionally, Reynolds continued, given the activation of the Carter Trust Amendment as described by the estate executor, the court is ordering an immediate freeze on all transfers of Carter Industries assets pending the completion of these proceedings. Mr. Whitmore, you are directed to have no further involvement in the operational management of Carter Industries effective immediately. He looked at Daniel to make sure the words had arrived. They had arrived. We'll reconvene in 72 hours, Reynolds said. Court is in recess. The gavel came down. The room erupted. Not in chaos, it was a courtroom, and the bailiffs maintained order, but in the controlled eruption of people who had witnessed something significant and could not entirely contain their response to it. Voices in the gallery, the sound of movement of chairs, of phones coming out of pockets the moment the bailiff cleared the room of the prohibition. Daniel did not move. Mitchell was already on his phone, his voice low and rapid. I need you to call the firm's criminal defense partner, right now, tonight. We have a referral situation, and I need coverage by... He turned slightly away, his voice dropping further. Daniel sat. He thought about the smirk, the one he had worn this morning when he signed the papers, the photograph of it that some clerk or gallery observer had probably already taken, and that was probably already making its way through the networks of people who followed courtroom proceedings, the networks of people who had known the Carter name for decades and were now watching the story of what had happened to Thomas Carter's company play out in real time. I thought about the $37 million that was no longer quietly sitting in accounts he controlled. He thought about the criminal referral. He thought about what the phrase criminal referral meant for the Amalfi Coast trip. And somewhere across the city, in the apartment with the curtains, Victoria had helped choose a phone, buzzed with a message that Daniel had not sent from a name she did not recognize, containing a link to a news alert that had gone up 40 minutes ago under the headline, Carter Industries Fraud Alleged CEO Ordered Removed from Operations. Victoria Hayes sat on the edge of the bed she had been sharing with Daniel Whitmore for 14 months, and she read the headline and she read it again, and she sat very still. Then she picked up her coffee and thought about what she was going to do next. She was not built for losing. She had told him that herself, and across the city in the courtroom that was emptying around him. Daniel Whitmore finally stood from his chair, straightened his jacket, and looked around the room with the expression of a man surveying territory that no longer belonged to him. Emily was at the door. She was speaking with Rosalind, her voice too low for Daniel to hear. She had her bag over her shoulder, and she was nodding at something Rosalind said, and then she looked up across the room, and she and Daniel met each other's eyes for the last time that day. He thought she might say something. He thought she might allow herself the moment now that the proceedings had gone the way they had to say something that reflected what had been taken from her and what had just been returned. She did not say anything. She looked at him for 3 seconds with the steady, clear gaze of a woman who had finished carrying something and put it down and did not intend to pick it up again. Then she turned and walked through the door, and the corridor lights caught her shoulders as she moved, and she looked in that particular quality of light like her father. The 72 hours between the first hearing and the continuation felt to Daniel Whitmore like falling in slow motion. I knew what falling felt like. He had experienced setbacks before, deals that went sideways, negotiations that collapsed, moments where the ground shifted and he had to find new footing fast. He had always found it. That was what he did. He was a man who found footing where other men found nothing, who turned reversals into advantages so smoothly that the people watching him often could not identify the exact moment when losing became winning. He drove back to the apartment. His apartment, the one Victoria had helped furnish, not the Beacon Hill house that was part of the settlement, and that he could no longer access under the asset freeze. And he sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and his phone, and the specific, unpleasant quiet of a man whose plans have just been structurally compromised and who needs to think. Victoria was not there. Her coat was gone from the hook by the door. Her coffee cup from this morning was washed and placed in the drying rack with a neatness that felt in the circumstances almost aggressive. There was no note. There was no message on his phone from her number. There was a text from Mitchell that said, "Call me when you can," and 3 missed calls from a number he did not recognize that he was fairly certain was a journalist because the news alert had gone up 4 hours ago and the story had been picked up by 2 financial publications and 1 local television station by the time he pulled into the parking structure. He called Mitchell. "How bad is the press?" he said before Mitchell could speak. "Manageable right now," Mitchell said. "The coverage is factual. Alleged fraud, operational removal, criminal referral. No one has the details of the witness testimony yet. That will change when the court transcript is released." "When does that happen?" 48 hours, maybe less. "Daniel, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I've spoken with our criminal defense partner, Patricia Osei. She is very good. She has handled referral situations before, and she knows how to— Is this going to become a criminal case? A pause, the kind of pause that carried its own answer inside it. The referral doesn't guarantee prosecution. The DA's office will review the material and determine whether there's sufficient basis to proceed. That process takes time. Patricia believes we have a window to get ahead of it, but that window is not large and it requires— Mitchell. Daniel's voice was quiet. "Stop managing me. Tell me what you actually think." Another pause, longer this time. "I think," Mitchell said carefully, "that the evidence is substantial. I think Paul Reeves's secondary ledger, combined with Whitfield's board testimony and Sandra Cho's account of the intercepted correspondence, constitutes a serious evidentiary foundation. I think the criminal referral is not a formality. And I think the 72 hours before we go back in front of Reynolds is not enough time to meaningfully change the trajectory of what happens in that courtroom." He stopped. "But it might be enough time to make decisions that affect what happens after." Daniel understood what Mitchell was not saying. He was not saying negotiate. He was not saying plea. He was using the language of a careful attorney who had not yet been authorized to use those words, but who was positioning his client to hear them when the time came. "I'll call you in the morning," Daniel said. He ended the call. He sat in the kitchen and thought about Thomas Carter for a long time. He thought about the dinner table comment, the one Thomas had apparently told Gerald Marsh about, the one that had become, in Thomas's interpretation, the moment he understood what Daniel was. Emily is lucky to have someone who understands business handling things for her because she's built for better things than balance sheets. He remembered saying it. He remembered the specific quality of the evening, the particular satisfaction of being at the Carter family table in a way that felt like ownership, like a rival. He remembered Emily's small smile at the compliment and Thomas's silence and how he had interpreted Thomas's silence as approval. He had been so certain. That certainty had been the center of everything. Every decision, every calculated move, every patient year of erosion. All of it had rested on his absolute certainty that he understood the situation better than anyone else in it. He understood Emily better than she understood herself. He understood the company better than she ever could. He understood what Thomas Carter was and what he was not. And what Thomas Carter was, in Daniel's assessment, was a man who loved his daughter and trusted his son-in-law and would not see what was happening until it was too late to do anything about it. He had been wrong about every single part of that. Emily had understood more than she let on. The company had been healthier than he'd claimed. And Thomas Carter, quiet and patient and absolutely clear-eyed, had seen Daniel coming from the very first dinner and had spent his remaining years building a structure designed to outlast him. Daniel set the glass down on the kitchen counter. I was alone in a way he had not been in a very long time. Not the pleasant solitude of a man who chooses to be by himself, but the specific structural aloneness of someone who has just discovered that the network of people he believed surrounded him was built on a foundation that had given way. Victoria was gone. His board allies were testifying against him. His CFO had cooperated with the estate. His executive assistant had described in a courtroom the correspondence she had intercepted on his behalf. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. It was not Victoria. It was not Mitchell. It was a number he recognized after a moment, Richard Pace, one of the Carter Industries board members. He had appointed himself one of the two who had not yet appeared in any of the proceedings. Richard Pace, who had sat on the board for 4 years and voted Daniel's way on every motion without exception. He answered it. Richard. Daniel. Richard's voice had a quality he had not heard in it before. Careful. Positioned. I've been watching the news alerts. I wanted to reach out. Appreciated. I've also been speaking with my own attorney. A pause. I want you to know that I've made the decision to cooperate fully with any investigation. I want to be clear that my cooperation is proactive and voluntary, and that I'm prepared to provide documentation of the board proceedings that I believe will help establish. Richard, Daniel said. His voice was very controlled. Don't. A silence. Daniel, I have to protect myself. My attorney has advised. I understand what your attorney has advised. I'm telling you as someone who has known you for 4 years and who has given you considerable opportunity during that time. Think very carefully about this. I have thought carefully about it. Richard's voice had steadied. He had made his decision before he called. The call was notification, not consultation. I'm sorry, Daniel. I genuinely am, but I am not going down with this. The line went quiet. Daniel set the phone on the counter. Richard Pace. 4 years of consistent votes and unquestioning support, and the moment the structure showed cracks, the calculation had shifted in under 24 hours. The calculation was always going to shift. Daniel had known this in some theoretical way, the way you know that a thing is possible without believing it will actually happen. He had built his board on loyalty, purchased with opportunity, and opportunity was an unstable currency worth everything when the market was rising, and worth nothing the moment it fell. The market had fallen. He slept badly. In the morning he met with Patricia Osei. She was in her 50s with close-cropped hair and the focused, unhurried manner of a woman who had spent 30 years in criminal law and had developed through that experience a complete allergy to anything that wasted time. She had reviewed Mitchell's summary of the proceedings and the forensic report overnight, and she sat across from Daniel with a yellow legal pad covered in her own careful handwriting, and she looked at him the way doctors look at patients when the results are not good, not unkindly but directly, without the softening that prevents the information from landing. I'm going to tell you what I see, she said, and then I'm going to tell you what I recommend, and I need you to hear both things without interrupting, because the second thing only makes sense in the context of the first. Go ahead, Daniel said. What I see is a case that the DA's office will almost certainly pursue. The secondary ledger is extraordinarily detailed and covers a 7-year period. The cooperation agreements with Reeves and Cho give the state 2 witnesses with direct operational knowledge. Whitfield gives them board-level corroboration without any cooperation arrangement, which means he is the most credible of the 3. The offshore accounts are documented. The shell companies are documented. The intercepted correspondence is documented. She set her pen down. Daniel, in 30 years of criminal defense work, I have seen cases with less evidence result in convictions. I have also seen cases with more evidence result in acquittals. But I want you to understand the landscape you are standing in before we discuss options. Understood, Daniel said. What do you recommend? Patricia picked up her pen. I recommend that we make contact with the DA's office today, proactively, before they come to us. I recommend that we open a conversation about cooperation, not a plea, not at this stage a conversation, and that we use the 72-hour window to establish that you are engaged and forthcoming before the court proceedings resume. She paused. A defendant who gets ahead of a criminal referral looks materially different to a prosecutor than a defendant who waits for an indictment. Daniel was quiet. What does cooperation look like, he said. Full financial disclosure, the offshore accounts, the shell company documentation, the complete transfer records. In exchange, the DA's office has the ability to consider what charges are appropriate and at what level. She met his eyes. I am not telling you this is a comfortable path. I am telling you it is the path most likely to preserve some portion of the future you still have access to. some portion of the future. Daniel sat with that phrase, some portion of the future. 3 days ago, his future had been a specific and vivid thing. The Amalfi Coast Victoria's laugh, the new life that was supposed to begin the moment Emily signed the papers. Now it had contracted to some portion of phrase that contained within it all the diminishment that the last 48 hours had produced. "Let me ask you something," he said. "Of course. The trust amendment. Emily gets the company back all voting rights, all operational authority. The settlement terms are voided by the amendment's activation. What does that mean for the divorce proceedings?" Patricia looked at him carefully. "It means the settlement you negotiated is not the settlement that will govern the dissolution of the marriage. The civil proceeding will be reconsidered in light of the trust amendment's activation and the fraud findings. Emily's attorneys will almost certainly seek a full accounting of the marital estate based on accurate financial information." She paused. "The $42 million settlement figure is not going to survive what happened in that courtroom yesterday." Daniel nodded slowly. He had known this. He had known it the moment Gerald Marsh read the number $280 million in a courtroom while Daniel sat 4 feet away. "And the personal assets freeze," he said. "How long?" "Pending resolution of both the civil and criminal matters. Potentially a significant period." She watched him absorb this. "Daniel, I know this is not what you planned for, but I need you to make decisions in the next 36 hours that reflect the situation as it actually exists, not the situation as it existed 3 days ago." He looked at her. "The situation as it actually exists." I thought about signing those papers with his flourish and his smirk, the confident signature of a man who believed he was autographing the first page of the rest of his life. He thought about how Emily had watched him do it, and had said nothing, just turned back to the judge with her steady eyes. She had known what was in that envelope. She had known for 14 months. She had sat through the entire settlement negotiation, through the conference rooms, and the attorneys, and the carefully arranged numbers, knowing that the document in escrow was going to render every one of those numbers irrelevant. She had signed her name to a settlement agreement she knew would be voided. She had let Daniel perform his victory with his pen and his flourish, and she had watched him with the patient, steady expression of a woman who understood that some truths had their own timing and could not be rushed. He had thought her composure was resignation. It was the composure of someone who was already on the other side of a thing. He had read her completely wrong. He had been reading her wrong for 12 years. "Schedule the call with the DA's office," he said, "this afternoon." Patricia nodded and picked up her phone. The call happened at 3 in the afternoon in Patricia's conference room with Mitchell present and a junior associate taking notes in a chair by the wall. The assistant district attorney on the other end was a woman named Carolyn Voss, whose voice carried the particular calibration of someone who had been expecting this call and was prepared to have it, but was not going to make it easy. "We appreciate Mr. Whitmore's proactive engagement," she said, with a neutrality that communicated its own set of meanings. "The referral from Judge Reynolds is currently being reviewed. We're not in a position to discuss any specific terms at this stage, but we are prepared to receive documentation." "What documentation would be most useful to your review?" Patricia asked. "Complete records of all transfers identified in the forensic report, account documentation for the offshore accounts identified in the Cayman Islands and the Isle of Man, corporate registration materials for all shell entities identified in the secondary ledger." A pause. "And any communications, email, text, documented conversations that bear on the decision-making process behind the transfers." Communications, email and text. Daniel thought about his phone. He thought about the messages between himself and Paul Reeves over 6 years, the careful coded language they had developed for discussions about the transfers language that was ambiguous enough to be deniable in most contexts, but that would not, he understood with sudden clarity, be ambiguous at all to a forensic communications analyst reading them in sequence with full context. "We'll compile the materials," Patricia said. "We'd appreciate that within 48 hours, Carolyn Voss said. "Before the continuation of the civil proceedings if possible." The call ended. Patricia looked at Daniel. "That went as well as it could have at this stage. The request for communications is significant. They're going to want to understand the internal decision-making, not just the transactions. I need you to give me full access to your business communications for the relevant period. Everything. Do not filter it before you give it to me." Daniel looked at her steadily. "Everything." Everything, she said. I have seen more cases compromised by a client's editorial decisions about what to share with their own attorney than by the underlying evidence. Whatever you think I don't need to see, you are wrong. Give me everything. He gave her everything. The next 36 hours were the hardest work Daniel Whitmore had ever done, and unlike every other hard work in his life, it was work that had no payoff. He could see from where he was standing. He sat with Patricia and Mitchell and the junior associate, and he walked through 7 years of decisions and transfers and communications and shell company structures, explaining each piece with the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent years maintaining a complex fiction and is now dismantling it in the presence of attorneys who are not there to judge him, but who are also not pretending that what they are hearing is anything other than what it is. He did not find it cathartic. People often described confession as cathartic. He found it mechanical and depleting, and occasionally punctuated by moments of sharp, specific shame that surprised him in their intensity, because he had believed he was past shame on these matters, had believed he had moved the particular transactions so far into the background of his daily consciousness that they no longer had the power to land with any weight. They landed with weight. The intercepted correspondence was the worst of it. Not the transfers. The transfers were financial maneuvers, things that could be framed, however unsuccessfully, within some vocabulary of corporate strategy. The intercepted correspondence was simpler and more direct in its wrongness. Emily, as a trust beneficiary, had a legal right to that information. The auditor's letter alone would have been enough to change the course of the last 5 years. She would have asked questions. She would have demanded answers. She would have been difficult in the way that informed people with legal standing are difficult, and Daniel's entire operation depended on her being easy. So he had made her easy, by keeping her in the dark, by taking her right to know and placing it in the hands of a 24-year-old executive assistant who had been told it was a legal arrangement and had believed him. He thought about Emily sitting at that table with her hands folded, hearing Sandra Cho describe it. He thought about the small shift in her posture, the one that happened when Sandra mentioned the auditor's letter. The almost imperceptible recognition of an absence made suddenly visible. 5 years of questions she had never gotten to ask. He had taken 5 years of her ability to understand her own inheritance. The shame had weight. The continuation hearing convened on the 3rd day, and Daniel walked back into the courtroom at 9 in the morning, with Patricia on one side and Mitchell on the other, and he sat at the defense table, and he did not look like the man who had signed papers with a flourish 3 days ago. He looked like what he was, a man in the middle of a significant reckoning, still composed, still present, but stripped of the particular quality of confidence that had always been in some way the most visible thing about him. Emily was at her table when he came in. She looked the same as she had looked on the first day. Gray dress replaced by a navy one, but the posture the same, the hands the same, the quality of stillness the same. She had brought someone with her today, a woman Daniel did not immediately recognize, seated in the row directly behind the plaintiff's table, who leaned forward and said something quietly to Emily before the proceedings began. Emily turned, slightly listened, nodded once and turned back. Daniel looked at the woman a moment longer and then placed her. Margaret Obey. She had been Carter Industries' head of operations for 8 years under Thomas Carter and had been eased out in the first 2 years of Daniel's tenure, replaced by someone Daniel had brought in himself. She was 62, a quiet, formidable woman who had known Thomas Carter as well as anyone, and who had apparently remained in contact with Emily throughout the years that Daniel had been telling Emily she did not need to be in contact with people from the company. One more thing he had not known. He was cataloging them now, all the things he had not known, with the grim efficiency of a man taking inventory after a flood, trying to understand the full extent of what had been quietly preparing itself while he was certain he was in control. Judge Reynolds entered. The room settled. "Before we begin with today's proceedings," Reynolds said, "the court has received notice that Mr. Whitmore has initiated voluntary cooperation with the district attorney's office regarding the criminal referral. This is noted for the record." He looked at both tables. "We will proceed today with the matter of the civil settlement terms and the activation of the Carter Trust Amendment." He looked at Rosalind Park. "Counselor, the estate's position on the settlement terms." Rosalind stood. She was wearing the focused, contained expression of a woman who had been building to this moment for 14 months and intended to make every word count. "Your Honor, the Carter estate's position is that the settlement terms agreed upon prior to the introduction of the trust amendment were reached through a process of material misrepresentation." Emily Whitmore agreed to a settlement based on financial information that was false. The company she agreed to accept a 5% stake in for $42 million is in fact worth approximately $280 million. The marital estate, including assets accumulated through the extraction of Carter Industries funds, is substantially larger than what was disclosed in the settlement negotiations. She paused. The estate requests that the court void the settlement in its entirety and order a full accounting of the marital estate based on accurate financial disclosure. Mr. Crane, the judge said. Mitchell rose. He was precise and careful, and he said the things that the situation still permitted him to say, that the accounting should include independent verification, that the cooperation with the DA's office reflected his client's good faith, that the court should consider a structured process rather than an immediate voiding. He was professional. He was thorough. How was also, and Danielle could see it in the particular set of his shoulders, working with what the situation had left him, which was considerably less than what he had walked in with 3 days ago. Reynolds listened. He made notes. He asked several questions of both attorneys precise and pointed the questions of a judge who had spent the recess reading the forensic report in full and wanted to be certain he understood its implications before he ruled. Then he looked up. The court finds that the settlement terms presented in this proceeding were reached under conditions of material misrepresentation and are therefore void, he said. The words were measured, and even the voice of a man delivering a decision he had arrived at carefully. The court orders a full forensic accounting of the marital estate to be completed within 60 days, conducted by an independent firm approved by both parties. He turned to the next page of his notes. Regarding the Carter Trust Amendment, the court finds that the conditions for activation have been met. Operational authority over Carter Industries reverts to Emily Carter Whitmore, effective immediately. All Voting Rights Board authority and operational control transfer to her as the trust's primary beneficiary. He paused. This transfer is not contingent on the completion of the divorce proceedings and takes effect as of today. Emily's hand resting on the table in front of her tightened very slightly, then it relaxed. Just for a moment, just that small tightening and release, and then she was composed again, her face still, her eyes on the judge. But in that brief, involuntary motion was everything. All 12 years of being told she couldn't, being guided away, being kept at the edges of the thing that was hers, all the board meetings she hadn't attended, and the letters she hadn't received, and the decisions that had been made without her around her in the space that should have been hers to occupy. It was hers now, all of it, immediately. Rosalind Park placed her hand briefly on Emily's forearm, a small gesture. Emily nodded once very slightly, and Rosalind withdrew her hand and straightened her papers. Margaret Obie in the row behind sat very still with her eyes forward, and her expression, the expression of a woman watching something, be returned to its rightful place after a long absence. Daniel watched all of this. He watched it with the full, clear attention of a man who understood that he was watching the completion of something his father-in-law had designed years before he died, a man who had spent the last months of his life in a hospital bed with a forensic attorney and a sealed envelope, and the absolute certainty that his daughter would be all right if the right structure was in place to protect her. Thomas Carter had been right. He had been right about all of it. With respect to Mr. Whitmore's involvement in Carter Industries going forward, Reynolds continued, the court's order removing him from operational management is extended indefinitely pending resolution of the criminal referral and the civil accounting. He is further directed to provide full disclosure of all assets, domestic and offshore, to the independent accounting firm within 30 days. 30 days. Daniel thought about the Cayman accounts. He thought about the Isle of Man account. He thought about the shell company structures that Paul Reeves had helped build, and that Paul Reeves had now handed in complete documented detail to the forensic team. He thought about 30 days of full disclosure and what full disclosure in this particular case actually meant for the future that Patricia had described as some portion. Court will recess until the accounting is complete, Reynolds said. Both parties will be notified of the continuation date. Any questions from counsel? Mitchell said no in the voice of a man who had run out of questions. Rosalind said no in the voice of a woman who had run out of nothing. The gavel came down. Daniel stood. He buttoned his jacket, a reflex something his hands did while his mind was elsewhere. He picked up his phone. He looked at the screen and saw that Victoria Hayes had sent a message at some point during the proceedings. He had not heard it arrive. He opened it. The message was 3 sentences. I saw the news. I think we both know this isn't something I can be part of. I wish you well, Daniel. He read it twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket. Mitchell appeared at his elbow. We need to talk next steps. Patricia wants a call this afternoon about the disclosure timeline. There are also 2 board members who have retained separate counsel and are requesting, "Give me a minute, Mitchell." A pause. Of course. Mitchell stepped away. Daniel stood alone at the defense table in the emptying courtroom. The clerks were moving around him. The gallery was clearing. Rosalind and Emily were near the door speaking with Margaret Obie, the 3 of them close together in the way of people who have a great deal to discuss and have been looking forward to the conversation. Emily laughed at something Margaret said. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, and she covered her mouth briefly with her hand, the way people do when laughter catches them in an unexpected moment. It was the laugh of a woman who had been through something hard and was discovering on the other side of it that she was still capable of the reflex. Daniel had not heard Emily laugh in a very long time. I thought about the woman he had first met 14 years ago, the one with the leather binder full of ideas and the absolute certainty that she was born to run her father's company. He thought about what he had done to that certainty year by year in the patient and systematic way of a man who understood that confidence was a structure that could be dismantled if you identified the right load-bearing points and applied pressure in the right places. He had identified them perfectly. He had applied the pressure expertly, and Thomas Carter, watching from across a dinner table with quiet eyes that saw everything, had spent the time his son-in-law was applying that pressure, building a counterstructure around his daughter, invisible and strong, that would hold her up when the pressure finally exhausted itself. The laugh carried across the emptying room. Daniel picked up his briefcase. He walked out of the courtroom without looking back. The first morning, Emily Carter walked into Carter Industries as its sole operational authority. She arrived 40 minutes early. Not because she was nervous. She had moved past nervous somewhere in the middle of the 3rd sleepless night after the hearing, when she had sat at the kitchen table in the Vermont house with a cup of tea and her father's old company binders, the ones she had kept in a box in the hall closet for 12 years, the ones Daniel had never known about because he had never thought to look, and she had read through them until the sky outside the window went from black to gray to the particular pale gold of early morning. By the time she set the last binder down, the nervousness had been replaced by something quieter and more durable. Not excitement exactly, more like recognition. The feeling of a person walking back into a room they have been kept out of for a long time and finding that they still know exactly where everything is. She arrived 40 minutes early because she wanted the building before it filled with people. She wanted to walk the floors and sit in the offices and stand in the doorways and let the place settle around her before she had to be anything to anyone. She wanted to be Thomas Carter's daughter alone in her father's company for 40 minutes before she had to be Carter Industries' CEO in front of its employees. Margaret Obie met her in the lobby. Margaret had driven 3 hours from where she had been living since Daniel eased her out 8 years ago, and she was standing by the reception desk with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a woman who had been looking forward to this particular morning for a very long time. "You're early," Emily said. "I've been early for 8 years," Margaret said, and handed her a cup. They walked the building together, the 2 of them through the manufacturing floors and the operations wing and the executive suites and the finance department, and Margaret talked and Emily listened, and what Margaret described was a company that was structurally sound beneath the surface damage Daniel had done to it, a company with a good workforce and a solid client base, and an operations backbone that Thomas Carter had built to last, and that had lasted despite everything, because the people who worked in it had continued to do their jobs well, even when the leadership above them was extracting value instead of building it. "The manufacturing team is solid," Margaret said. "Carl Bemis has been running the floor for 11 years. He is exceptionally good. Daniel never paid much attention to the floor. He was a finance man, not an operations man, so Carl was essentially left alone to do his work. That's why production numbers stayed strong, even when the reported financials didn't reflect it." "I want to meet with Carl this week," Emily said. "I scheduled it for Thursday. I also scheduled the department heads for Friday afternoon. I thought you'd want a few days to review the real financial picture before you sat down with the full leadership team." Emily looked at her. "You scheduled all of this before I asked you to." Margaret looked back with the expression of a woman who had organized things for a very long time and found the activity natural. "You were going to ask me to. I just saved you the step." Emily thought about the 8 years Margaret had been away from this building. 8 years that had happened because Daniel had recognized with the accurate instincts of a man who understood threats that Margaret Obi was exactly the kind of person who would not allow herself to be managed, who would ask the questions that needed asking, and notice the things that needed noticing, and who therefore needed to be removed before she noticed something that mattered. He had removed her before she could. "Margaret," Emily said, "I want you to come back, formally, officially. Whatever title you want, whatever terms you need. I want you here." Margaret was quiet for a moment, not because she needed to think about it. The moment had a weight that deserved a beat of silence before the answer. "Chief Operating Officer," she said, "same as before." "Done," Emily said. They shook hands in the middle of the operations floor, surrounded by the early morning sounds of a company coming to life. And it was the first official decision Emily Carter made as the CEO of Carter Industries, and it felt in the specific and grounded way of right decisions exactly like what it was. The first week was relentless. Rosalind Park called every morning with updates on the civil accounting, which was proceeding with the methodical thoroughness of an independent firm that had been given full access to both sets of financial records and was in the process of constructing a complete picture of the marital estate. The numbers coming out of the accounting were, as the forensic report had suggested, considerably larger than what Daniel had disclosed. The offshore accounts alone contained just over $19 million. The shell companies held assets that were still being traced and valued. The independent firm's preliminary estimate of the full marital estate was somewhere north of $300 million a number, that made the original $42 million settlement look not merely unfair, but openly contemptuous. "I was never going to give you what you were owed," Rosalind told her on the fourth morning in a voice that was matter-of-fact rather than angry. The settlement wasn't a compromise. It was an insult designed to look like a compromise. "I know," Emily said. "How long have you known?" Emily thought about it. "I think I started knowing around year 9. I didn't have language for it yet. I didn't have proof. But I knew something was deeply wrong." She paused. "I just didn't know how to trust what I knew." "Your father knew you'd get there," Rosalind said. "Yes," Emily said. "He was more patient about it than I deserved." On the 5th day, Patricia Osei called. Not Emily's attorney, Daniel's. She called Rosalind, and Rosalind called Emily, and the call that followed was short and significant. Daniel, through Patricia, was prepared to make a full settlement offer, one that included the offshore accounts, his personal real estate holdings, his investment portfolio, and a negotiated stake in the proceeds from the civil accounting. He was also prepared to enter a cooperation agreement with the DA's office that would resolve the criminal referral through a plea to reduce charges in exchange for full restitution and a period of supervised release. I was not going to fight. The certainty that had defined him, the gorgeous, expensive certainty that he had always been the smartest person in any room, had run out of the room and left him with the accountant's version of his life, and the accountant's version did not support fighting. Emily listened to Rosalind describe the offer. She was quiet for a moment. "Tell Patricia we'll review it," she said, "and tell her that what I care about most is the full accounting. I'm not interested in a settlement that buries the real number. I want the actual figure on record. I want it documented." "Because of Carter Industries?" Rosalind asked. "Because of my father," Emily said. "He built something real with real money and real work. I want the record to be accurate about what was taken from it." Rosalind said she understood. She did. The accounting took 51 days. During those 51 days, Emily ran Carter Industries. It was not graceful at first. It was not the smooth, confident leadership of a woman who had been doing this for years. Because she had not been doing this for years. She had been kept away from it systematically and deliberately for 12 years, and the skills that should have been sharpened by a decade of practice were instead the skills she had kept alive by instinct and study in the margins of the life Daniel had designed for her. She made mistakes. She asked questions that more experienced executives would not have needed to ask. She reversed 2 decisions she had made in the first week after Margaret and Carl Bemis helped her see what she had not seen initially. She did not pretend otherwise. This was the thing that surprised people most in those first weeks. Not that she made mistakes, but that she owned them immediately and corrected them without drama and moved on. The board members who had survived Daniel's purge and the criminal referral process, the ones who had stayed and were now watching their new CEO navigate the first month expected defensiveness. They expected the performance of confidence from a woman who needed to prove she deserved to be there. What they got instead was someone who walked into a board meeting on the third week, looked at the 7 people around the table and said, "I want to be honest with you about where I am. I know this company the way a person knows a house they grew up in. I know its bones. I know its history. I know what it's supposed to feel like. I don't yet know every room the way I need to. I'm asking for your patience and your directness. If you see something I'm missing, I need you to tell me." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Carl Bemis, who had driven 3 hours to attend the board meeting because Margaret had told him it mattered, and Carl Bemis went where Margaret told him to go, said that's the first honest thing anyone has said in a board meeting in this building in about 7 years. The room laughed. The tension that had been sitting in the walls for 7 years moved slightly. Not gone, not instantly, but shifted. On the 43rd day of the accounting, something happened that Emily had not anticipated. She was in her office, her father's old office, which she had moved into, not without difficulty, because the room still carried his presence in a way that required a period of adjustment when Rosalind called with a different quality in her voice. Not the controlled, professional voice of an attorney delivering information. A different voice, quieter. "Emily, I need to tell you something that came out of the accounting, something that isn't in the financial records." Emily set her pen down. "Tell me." The forensic team was reviewing correspondence from the Carter Industries Board archives as part of the accounting. Letters, memos, internal documentation going back to your father's tenure. Rosalind paused. "They found a letter, written by Thomas addressed to you, dated 3 weeks before he died." Emily's chest tightened. "It was in the board archive because he filed it there deliberately," Rosalind said. "He told Gerald Marsh to put it there. He said—" She stopped briefly. "He said he wanted it to be found after everything else had been found. He said the other documents would explain the what and the how, but this letter was the why." Emily was very still. "Can you read it to me?" she said. Rosalind read it. Thomas Carter's voice came through the words, the way the voices of people who wrote with real intention came through present direct entirely themselves. He had written that he had spent the last months of his life worrying about 2 things. The first was the company. The second and the larger was Emily. He wrote that he had watched Daniel diminish her with the particular helplessness of a father who understood what was happening, but also understood that Emily would have to find her own way out of it, because the kind of strength that is built by enduring and surviving a thing could not be borrowed from someone else. He wrote that he had done what he could do legally and structurally, but that the thing he could not do was be there when she needed to remember who she was. He wrote that she had always been exactly who she needed to be, that she had known how to run the company since she was 22 years old, with a leather binder and a room full of ideas, that the certainty Daniel had eroded was not gone, it was just buried, and things that are buried can be found. He wrote that he was sorry he would not be there to see her find it. He wrote that he knew she would. Emily sat in her father's office with the phone against her ear and Rosalind's voice reading the last paragraph, and for the first time since the morning she had signed the settlement papers, since years before that, she cried. Not the small, controlled tears of a woman managing her composure in a difficult situation, real crying, the kind that came from the deepest part of the 12 years, from the accumulated weight of being told so many times in so many patient and systematic ways that she was not enough, and from the sudden, complete, overwhelming evidence that her father had never believed any of it for a single day. She cried for several minutes. Then she wiped her face. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. The final accounting was completed on the 51st day. The marital estate accurately valued was $314 million. The settlement agreement, the one Daniel had prepared, the one that would have given Emily $42 million and a 5% stake in a company worth $280 million, was formally and permanently voided by the court. The divorce settlement that replaced it was different in every particular. Emily received a cash settlement of $68 million, representing her equitable share of the assets Daniel had accumulated using Carter Industries funds, the offshore accounts the shell company precedes the personal investments built on extracted money. She retained full ownership of Carter Industries under the trust terms. She retained the Vermont property. She received a structured payment arrangement tied to the liquidation of Daniel's remaining personal assets to be administered by the court. Daniel received a plea agreement with the district attorney's office that included restitution 3 years of supervised probation and a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any public company. He received no prison time because Patricia Osei was very good at her job and because his cooperation had been genuinely complete and genuinely early. He received the opportunity, as Patricia had described it, to build some portion of a future from what remained. He signed the plea agreement on a Tuesday morning. There was no smirk. There was no flourish. He signed his name in the small, controlled signature of a man who understood exactly what he was signing and had no performance left to give. 2 months after the settlement was finalized, Emily held a company-wide meeting at Carter Industries. She stood in front of 430 employees, the full workforce including the manufacturing floor and the administrative staff and the operations team and the engineering division, and she talked for 22 minutes without notes. She talked about her father and what he had built and why it had lasted. She talked about the 7 years and what had happened to the company's finances and what the full accounting had revealed, because she believed the workforce deserved to know the truth about the institution they had given their working lives to. She talked about what was going to change and what was going to stay the same, and what was going to stay the same was everything her father had built the company on: quality integrity, the understanding that the people who built the product were the most important people in the building. She talked about her own absence from the company during the years she should have been running it, and she did not soften that or explain it away. She said she had been kept away, and she had allowed herself to be kept away, and she intended to spend the next chapter of her professional life making up for the time that had been lost. When she finished, Carl Bemis started clapping. It started on the manufacturing floor with Carl, and it moved through the room the way things move through rooms when they are genuine, not the polite performed applause of a corporate event, but the real kind, the kind that comes from people who have been watching a situation for a long time and are relieved and grateful that it has finally resolved into something they can be part of. Emily stood at the front of the room and received it and did not look away. In the weeks that followed, she made the decisions she had been thinking about since the first morning she walked the floors with Margaret. She reinstated the employee profit-sharing program her father had built and Daniel had quietly eliminated in year 3. She funded the apprenticeship program in the manufacturing division that Thomas had started and that had been defunded without explanation 2 years after his death. She restructured the board to include 2 employee representatives, a change that would have been unthinkable under Daniel, and that produced in the first board meeting where the representatives were present the best operational discussion the board had conducted in 7 years. She hired an external ethics officer. She commissioned an independent annual audit and made the results available to all employees. She called the auditor whose letter had been intercepted 5 years ago, a man named David Kwan, now at a different firm, and she thanked him personally for writing it, and she told him what had happened to the letter. And there was a silence on the phone line that contained everything a silence can contain when a person learns that an action they took in good faith had been buried and that it had mattered more than they knew. "I'm glad it eventually got where it was going," David Kwan said. "It took 5 years longer than it should have," Emily said. "But yes, Carter Industries was always a good company," he said. "It had good bones." "It did," Emily said. "My father built it that way." 6 months after the settlement, on a Saturday morning, Emily drove to the cemetery where Thomas Carter was buried. She sat beside the stone for a long time without speaking. She had brought the letter, the one from the board archive, the one Gerald Marsh had filed under Thomas's instruction, the one Rosalind had read to her over the phone on the 43rd day of the accounting. She had read it many times by now. She could have recited it from memory, but she had brought it anyway because there was something about holding the physical thing, the paper her father had touched with the same hands he had used to build the company and sign the trust documents and hold hers when she was small, and something had frightened her that felt like the right way to have this particular conversation. She talked to him. She told him about the meeting with the 430 employees and Carl Bemis starting the applause on the manufacturing floor. She told him about Margaret coming back as COO and what the operations floor looked like when Margaret was running it, which was, she said, exactly the way it had looked when he was running it. She told him about the apprenticeship program and the ethics officer and the employee board representatives. She told him about the letter, the one he had written, the one that had made her cry in his office on the 43rd day. She told him she wished he had been there. She told him that the company was good, that it had his bones in it, and it was going to be all right. She told him that she had found it, the thing that was buried. The certainty that had been under everything Daniel had layered on top of it for 12 years, still there, still intact. The way things built to last are still there when you clear away what was covering them. She sat with him for a while longer in the quiet of that Saturday morning. And then she stood up, and she straightened her jacket, and she thought of him saying when she was small and something had frightened her, "Stand up straight. Emmy, the thing you're afraid of is always smaller than it looks." She stood up straight. She walked back to her car. She had a board meeting on Monday, and a manufacturing review on Tuesday, and a call with the independent auditor on Wednesday, and 430 people whose working lives were her responsibility, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she had been built to do, and the man who had spent 12 years telling her otherwise was signing monthly restitution payments and attending court-mandated financial oversight meetings in a life that had contracted to fit the truth of what he was. Thomas Carter had seen all of this. He had seen it from a dinner table 9 years before it happened, with quiet eyes that missed nothing, and he had spent the last months of his life making certain that the story ended the right way. It ended the right way. Emily Carter walked back into the rest of her life, and she carried her father with her, and she did not look back at what she was leaving behind, because the woman who had been diminished and doubted and systematically kept from her own inheritance had walked out of that courtroom and did not live here anymore. What lived here was Thomas Carter's daughter. And Thomas Carter's daughter knew exactly who she was.